She was late. Riordan glanced towards the mantel clock. The hand showed only a minute had passed since the last time he had checked. He wished Miss Caulfield would hurry up. He was hungry, and he was regretting his harshness with her that afternoon. She couldn't possibly know what she'd walked into. Still, late was late. He'd been very clear when he'd sent up the invitation that he'd wished to dine at 7 o'clock sharp. It was now 5 minutes past. Not that he was in the habit of dining with governesses. He wasn't. He hadn't dined with the first 5. But they hadn't been young and pretty, nor had they dominated his thoughts for the duration of the afternoon. They'd been dried-up old sticks who thought far too much about propriety and far too little about living. It was no wonder they hadn't lasted. If there was one thing he knew, it was how to have fun. He was determined that children would have that, if nothing else, after all they'd been through. On those grounds, he was doing quite well in his new role as a father figure. He'd be the first to admit he liked children. He just didn't have a clue about how to bring them up. His brother Elliot had been the mature one there. It had been Elliot who'd taken on Cecilia and William 4 years ago, after the children's father died of a sudden fever. Now Elliot was gone too. No one had ever imagined the children would be stuck with him and whatever help he could cobble together. The rustle of skirts at the door told him his latest attempt at acquiring such help had arrived.
"I apologize for being tardy. I'd expected to dine with the children. The summons was a surprise."
This last was said with the faintest hint of frost, to suggest he wasn't quite forgiven for his earlier harshness.
"The invitation,"
Riordan corrected, with a smile in an attempt at melting her glacial greeting. He'd expected as much, especially after his rather cold dismissal this afternoon. He hoped to make it up to her with dinner. He couldn't afford to have another governess leave. He knew what he meant by offering dinner, but it was clear from her choice of dress she didn't know what to make of his request. Was this work? Was this a get-to-know-you welcome sort of dinner? She'd clearly opted for the former. She'd chosen a modestly cut gown of deep green poplin, trimmed in white lace. It was prettily done, nicely suited for tea at the Squire's or an afternoon of shopping in the village, but nowhere near fashionable enough for dinner in London with the town's leading rogue. The simplicity of the gown and the practicality of its fabric created a stark contrast against his formal evening attire.
"Are you going out this evening?"
Her eyes swept him briefly, likely trying to gauge the gravity of her mistake. Her mind was easy to read, not because she was transparent, but because she was not afraid to be straightforward. He'd enjoyed her boldness this afternoon, even if it had ended on a sour note.
"Yes, but nothing that demands my attendance with any scheduled rigor. I'm free to arrive when I choose."
Going out had lost much of its allure in the months since his brother's death. 3 months of mourning was the standard for a sibling, if the sibling had managed to die conventionally. Elliot had not. As a result, London was happy to let Riordan proceed as usual with his customary social routine after a 2-week hiatus to fetch the children from Chatham Court. Riordan suspected such benevolence had more to do with society's greed for gossip. If he was left rusticating for 3 months in grief, there'd be considerably fewer rumours for the scandalmongers to spread regarding his brother's demise, and the season would be that much duller for it. The butler announced dinner, and he offered Miss Caulfield his arm. Secretly pleased she was as discomfited with his show of propriety as she'd been with his earlier impropriety.
"Such formality,"
she commented, taking the chair Riordan held out for her at the table.
"I apologize for being underdressed. I wasn't sure—"
Her voice trailed off, and Riordan imagined her upstairs in her room, debating the merits of the green poplin or the one good silk gown she owned.
"You were right to save the silk for a better occasion,"
he said lightly, taking his own seat.
"How did you know?"
She shot him a sharp look.